May the 4th be with you. Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Appropriately today, we're going to be reading a whole bunch of Star Wars books.
May the 4th be with you!
It is Star Wars Day, May the 4th, and I thought this would be the perfect time to release a video doing one of my challenges for the year, which is finally getting into some of the Star Wars novels. I love Star Wars, have been a fan for a long time, but always felt really intimidated by the books and got some incredible recommendations from other people, which has created this list of books that I'm reading for this video. So this is the beginning of a vlog. I appropriately have my R2-D2 shirt on, and I'm going to share with you the 5 books that I'm going to be reading for today's video, hopefully in time for May the 4th, Star Wars Day, to post. That is the goal, and I think it's going to be really fun. I have started the first one already. I have some things to say, but before that, let me show you the rest of my TBR. I will be reading Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older. This is a Han Solo and Lando novel. Brotherhood by Mike Chen, which is Anakin and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Thrawn by Timothy Zahn, because of course we need a good villain in the mix. The Princess and the Scoundrel by Beth Revis, because of course I wanted a romance. I mean, who wouldn't want Han and Leia's romance in a canon book? Yeah, thank you. And finally, the book that I have started reading, Bloodline by Claudia Gray, which so far I'm really enjoying. This is following Princess Leia in the time before the latest trilogy of films. She is kind of getting fed up with the Senate and all of the bureaucracy and puts herself on this mission to figure out something going on a planet, right? Meanwhile, accompanying her is a senator from the other side of the aisle who seems to kind of be into collecting items from the Empire, and Leia is just not having it. I'm really enjoying this. We've got a middle-aged Leia, and she's just like fed up with politics and is finally out in the field again, dealing with maybe being kidnapped, dealing with the underworld, and I feel like this is going to be a really good time. So this is what I have started. I will do some check-ins whenever I finish a book, and I may try to see if there are any fun Star Wars related activities we could do. I live in New York City. Sometimes there's cool stuff here. We'll see if we can get some Star Wars fun into this video one way or another, but welcome to the beginning of the vlog. I hope you enjoy it, and of course, may the Force be with you. I finished reading Bloodline, and I think for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to do a ton of updates throughout the books. I feel like these are maybe the kinds of books that I want to talk about a little more comprehensively, so I may give an update when I've kind of begun a book and then talk more about it once I've finished it, and at the end of the video kind of give some thoughts on what this project has been like and my experience. I feel like that's going to be the best way to do this. I am, however, planning on doing a couple of slightly Star Wars related trips in New York City. We'll see what we can throw in here to jazz things up. But Bloodline, I really enjoyed this a lot. I think this was a great recommendation. I hadn't heard a lot of negative things about this. Many people who are into the Star Wars novels had recommended this as a good place to begin or a good book to pick up, especially since I like Leia as a character, and knowing that I'm less into the action side of things and more into the political and character side of things. I think this was a fantastic recommendation. It is very focused on the intricacies of changing politics during this time period. This is leading up to the creation of the First Order, and one of the themes of this is Leia wrestling with her bloodline, with the fact that she is the daughter of Darth Vader and what that means for her. But it's also this fun adventure. We've got interesting side characters who are going to play important roles in later parts of what's going to happen, and I just really enjoyed it. I liked all of the different character perspectives we got. I think this is an interesting time of life to see Leia in, where she's a little bit conflicted about what she's doing and who she wants to be. I would say she's middle-aged at this point. Han is usually off traveling, even though they are still together. Her son Ben is pretty much grown. He's off with her brother, so she's left doing politics, where she feels like her role is less and less meaningful all the time, and, you know, is dreaming of going off and joining Han on adventures, but then of course gets roped into different things. And I like it. I think it captures a kind of relatable period of time in women's lives where maybe their children need them less and they're wondering what they're doing. They're aging, they are less relevant than they used to be, but they still have a lot to offer the world. And I think that's kind of where Leia is sitting in this moment. And I enjoyed seeing her there. I also thought it was interesting to see the different currents of politics and how they would eventually converge in such a way as to allow the First Order to, you know, kind of come back. Also, given when this was written, because like, when was this written? I have some thoughts. Okay, yeah. So it's interesting, right? Because this came out in 2016. So if you think about what was happening in the world as Claudia Gray was writing this, we are leading up to a Trump presidency and people romanticizing the past, a past that really wasn't so great for most people. And I think you see a lot of parallels in Bloodline where there are people romanticizing the Empire. And those are the people who are going to end up pushing the First Order into existence, but they secretly look back on the old glory days where there was centralized power and things were so much better, even though we know, and that's one of the themes that this book is grappling with, that it wasn't good for most people, that a lot of people were harmed by it, that bringing that back will not be good for anyone. So I think it's really interesting contextually when you think about when this book came out and the themes that it's exploring in the Star Wars universe and how that parallels some of the things that were happening in the American political climate in that year. So I really enjoyed this. It was great. I would probably give this like a 4.5-star rating, and it was a strong way to begin this project. Very enjoyable. And for some of these, I am listening to the audiobooks and not just reading physically, and that has been fun because it seems like some of these Star Wars audiobooks are really highly produced with sound effects, and that's just super cool. I am enjoying it. It feels very immersive, and so I'm probably, when I'm able to get a hold of an audiobook, going to continue to at least partly consume the books that way. The next book that I'm reading for the project, and I have begun it but I'm not very far in yet, is Last Shot, a Han and Lando novel. This one is by Daniel Jose Older, who is an author I really enjoy, and this is kind of fun. We're going back in time a bit from Bloodline, right? This is set right before the creation of the First Order. This is set quite a bit earlier, where Ben is a 2-year-old and Han is not yet sort of found his place. Leia is trying to get things going politically, and Han and Lando have to kind of work together to deal with some problems that are cropping up from their past. So far, it's fun. It's funny. It's got a great sense of humor, which I'm not super surprised. Daniel Jose Older tends to have humor that works for me. I feel like this one is going to be a blast. So Bloodline is finished. Last Shot is in process. And unless something really major happens, I'll probably check back in once I have finished this book to give you my thoughts. I finished reading Last Shot by Daniel Jose Older, and boy, do I have some thoughts. To be honest though, my thoughts are less about the book. I do have thoughts about the book, but even more than that, I have thoughts about the reviews on Goodreads because they are a trip. So my feelings on this book. Not the strongest book I've read, but still a good time. I liked it. I would give this like a 3.5 star. I think I enjoyed it. It met my expectations. It wasn't perfect. I think it has some pacing issues. It's a little bit longer than it needs to be, but it's a good time. I think it gives what it's supposed to give, which is a buddy adventure between Han Solo and Lando. I like some of the themes it's exploring. We've got Han Solo as a new father. Ben is 2 years old and he is struggling with how to be a dad. He didn't have a good dad growing up and he never expected to be a husband and a father and is kind of wrestling with what that means for who he is. Lando is maybe falling in love for real for the first time, and so that's a whole thing. So I like the character development of these two kind of scoundrels who are finding their place in life and figuring out where they fit. Meanwhile, having to deal with some trouble from the past that is coming up and threatening the security of the galaxy, right? And then we have flashbacks to them before, which I enjoyed. This was fun. I had a good time with it. I found it enjoyable. I do think it's a little bit longer than it needs to be, and the pacing is sometimes not the best. And, you know, this isn't my favorite thing. I mean, granted, I've not read many Star Wars books at this point, but like I liked it. Would I go out and reread this? No, probably not. Is this going to be the best thing I read in this project? Probably not, but I think it's good. And if you look at the Goodreads reviews, you would not think this is good because, man, there are a lot of negative reviews of this. And you know what's really, really interesting to me is if you go in and start reading those reviews, a lot of it is these conservative white dudes in their feelings about the fact that this has some curse words and some queer people just existing. Like, it's so interesting to me. There's literally a review that is upset that there are queer characters when their queer identity is not central to the plot. They're like, I'm okay with reading gay people as long as it's actually important to the plot, but this just feels like an agenda because, you know, there's a gay person and there's a non-binary character who is awesome, by the way. They are a fantastic character. There's this non-binary pilot who is a riot, and I think they're great, but this person was like, why are you confusing me with they, them pronouns when I'm just here for lightsaber battles or whatever, you know, blaster battles, since it's Han and Lando. It is wild, y'all. Wild, because the double standards on this are something else. If we're gonna reverse this logic, should I then also say, man, what the hell? Why are these characters being pushed on us as being heterosexual when their sexual identity has nothing to do with the story? Why are you telling us Han finds this woman attractive? It's not moving the plot forward. Come on, it's an agenda. Keep it to yourself. Like, people don't say stuff like that. It's such a double standard and it's absurd. Literally, there's just a couple of queer people existing in the Star Wars world, God forbid. Anyway, yeah, so it is a wild ride reading some of the reviews on this book. It made me want to rate it higher almost. Again, do I think that this is probably the strongest book? No, it's not even the strongest book I've read from Daniel Jose Older, but I think it's fun, I think it's entertaining, and I think it gets the vibe of the characters and centering them in this place where they're at a real turning point in their lives and, you know, struggling with what that means about who they are. I liked it. So 3.5 stars for me. I thought it was a pretty good time. I will say this threat, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it, but this threat is a big one. The actual plot is pretty wild and pretty interesting, the way that it all unfolds and comes together. There's some fantastic side characters, there's a lot of humor. It's a good time. I mean, what's not to like, really? Unless you're just uncomfortable because, like, there's some curse words and some queer folks and okay. Whatever. Anyway, it was fun. I liked it. On to the next one. So I am reading Star Wars Brotherhood, which is really interesting in terms of what it's saying about some of the relationships between Anakin and Padme, Anakin and Obi-Wan, Anakin and Palpatine. But today I just dropped my kids off at camp for spring break, and I thought it might be a good day to go explore some places with Star Wars merch in the city. So let's go.
May the Force be with you! Star Wars Day! Star Wars Day! May 1st! Star Wars Day! Star Wars Day!
So unfortunately, the escalator in the Times Square Disney store was not working, which meant I couldn't go upstairs where the majority of their Star Wars section is, but they did have a few things downstairs and they brought me down a couple of shirts for my kids. These are the 2023 May the 4th Be With You shirts. They're adorable, super cute design. Anyway, it was really fun. If you're ever in New York City, I would recommend the Disney store. They have a big Star Wars section on the second floor of the store. Maybe if I feel super motivated, I'll try going back some other time before this video is over, but if I don't, I would recommend it. I did finish reading Brotherhood today, blew through this, and I have a lot of thoughts. This, I ended up loving by the end. However, It is very slow to start. I've got to say, like, we got a little ways into this book and I was like, I'm kind of bored. Why are people saying this is so good? But I get it. I get it now. It is very, very good. It just takes a while to kind of get into the flow of the things that are actually interesting about it. But this does so much character work for key characters that foreshadows some of the choices they're going to make in the future and fleshes out the relationships that they have with each other and the kinds of people that they are in really interesting ways, while also having this kind of political conspiracy plot moving things along. It's really, really excellent. I feel like, because, you know, one of my issues with, you know, episode 2 and 3 in particular is that I had some issues with the characterization of Anakin, especially from this more emotional perspective with his relationship with Padme and why they were connected to each other and why they fall in love. And there are a lot of gaps, I feel like, in the characterization that took place in those films, and I think that this book is filling in some of those gaps, and I think also giving us a lot more insight into Obi-Wan Kenobi and who he is, the kind of relationship he has to Anakin. It's funny because I just recently, for the first time in a while, went back and rewatched the very first Star Wars film, episode 4. We showed it to our kids for the first time, which was really fun. But one thing that kind of struck me is that in that film, Ben, talking to Luke about his dad, says he was a good man and an even better friend, and a good friend. I'm maybe getting the line slightly off, but I think this is a book where you really see the friendship that existed between, you know, I mean, like, yes, there was tension and yeah, they argued with each other, but you really see the friendship and the partnership between Anakin and Obi-Wan. And it's, you know, in some ways sad because you know what's gonna happen, but you also see all of these different forces at play, the different people influencing Anakin, including the story told to him by his mother that he's made a central tenet of his sense of identity, which I think is quite fascinating. And I think what's interesting in this book too is it explores a bit of this conflict with Jedi between emotion and duty. And I think part of what's interesting about this is it pushes back a little bit on the idea that the Jedi have it all figured out, that duty is really the way to go, but then at the same time also shows the problems with untempered emotion and the damage that that can cause and how those things kind of exist in tension with each other, which again is like foreshadowing things we're gonna get later on in the story. Obi-Wan is a smart dude and he sees the connection between Anakin and Padme. He can sense what it is and he hopes that Anakin will grow past it and that he won't have to confront him over it. And while we know that that's not the case, we get a strong sense of why several times in the course of this novel, when presented with opportunities to bring his concerns to the council, for instance, he chooses to wait. He chooses to be patient. And whether that's good or bad, I mean, it's I don't know, it's arguable, right? There is this interaction between a couple of side characters that's interesting that kind of mirrors what we're eventually going to see in the dynamic between Obi-Wan and Anakin. You know, I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but there are side characters where there's somebody who had been a mentor and somebody who she thought was trustworthy, who's been seduced by people on the dark side of the Force, we'll say, and she has to confront the fact that she misjudged things and decide what to do after that. And like I said, it's interesting because it's mirroring what we know is going to be coming for Anakin and Obi-Wan in the future, where Obi-Wan is going to be faced with a very similar circumstance and have to make some hard decisions. I ended up really liking this. The subplot also is, I think, doing a good job of showing how much harm can take place when an empire or a large sort of governmental organization overlooks the value of a marginalized culture and the way that that can breed sometimes anger and extremism because of the mistreatment of people. And this is really showing us the importance of humanity and the individual not just the larger whole. So I really like this. It's a very nuanced book. It's doing a lot of interesting things. Excellent. One of the best that I've read, I would say. Again, very slow to start. So this would be probably a 4-star rating for me just because the beginning was so slow and kind of dull. But once it really picked up and got more into what was going on with these characters and also the actual action part of the plot, it was really good. So highly recommend this one if you haven't read it. It was fantastic. So I think the next one I'm going to be reading is Thrawn. I will touch base once I've started. I finished reading Thrawn and it was really good. I've heard probably the most hype about this book, and a lot of people have said they love Timothy Zahn. I know he's been writing in the Star Wars world for a long time, and having read this, I can see why people feel this way because this was excellent. Thrawn is such a fascinating character. He's got a lot of nuance to him. He's smart, he thinks strategically, he's manipulating everybody towards his own aims, including the Emperor, which is kind of cool. And the story deftly weaves together his story to the point that by the end of it, you know more about what Thrawn's end goal is, why he's doing what he's doing, and what this all has been leading up to. So interesting. I know there are more books that he's written about Thrawn, and I would be interested in trying them out because this was very good. I think one thing that is very effective about this book is it shows you the bureaucracy of the Empire. It shows you the corruption, but also the way that small political squabbles between people affect things. And I think what's interesting about a character like Thrawn is he has his own aims. And so while he doesn't fully buy into the ideology of the Empire, he also isn't idealistic enough to be a rebel. And I don't know, he's kind of like a political realist, I guess, to a certain extent. And it's interesting hearing the things that he says by the end of this. Yeah, like there's a lot of political nuance to this book, and the ideas it's exploring, the questions it's asking, that as much as we know there are a lot of problems with the Empire, it's not just about the figurehead people, it's about all of the bureaucrats and all of the infighting and the corruption and the way that it affects actual individual people. And does political upheaval and rebellion fix that? Or does it just create its own new problems? I really liked this a lot. It was so good. So Thrawn is not the only perspective character. There are 2 other perspectives as well, and I was very invested in both of them. I think they're also quite interesting characters, and seeing their development through the course of the book is fascinating. You know, of course, reading this as somebody who is familiar with the franchise and kind of knows where things are going, this takes place prior to episode 3, and so one of the things that we know that pieces of information are building toward is the creation of the Death Star, which is in its early stages of creation. And that I think is kind of cool when you think about it from a place of resource allocation for the government and what their plans for it are. And this kind of ends with questions about that. Yeah, this was fantastic. Probably like a 4.5-star read. I would definitely pick up more from Timothy Zahn in the future, and I would read more books about Thrawn. I think he's an interesting character. He's from this kind of mysterious alien race that are warlike and formidable, but we don't know much about them. Clearly, they think really strategically. We know from being inside Thrawn's head that he is hyper aware of people's reactions to things. Their heart rate changes, their posture changes, their pupil dilation, the way that their body language tells you how they're feeling or what they're thinking. And that just makes him really interesting. I think it's the same sort of intelligence that makes somebody like a Sherlock Holmes character interesting. But in this case, we have somebody who is on, you know, the bad side, who you're not necessarily supposed to be rooting for, but you kind of do by the end to a certain extent. I mean, he's definitely an anti-hero. I wouldn't call him a villain or a hero. He's out for himself and his own aims. But he's a good character. So yeah, loved this. Definitely a hit. I've got one book left to read and then we will wrap up this vlog. I finished reading The Princess and the Scoundrel. I've got thoughts, and then we're gonna kind of wrap up this vlog and talk about my big picture thoughts and what I might be planning moving forward. So I gotta say, I partly saved this one for last because I thought it might be my favorite of the bunch. That did not turn out to be the case. I assumed, because I'm a romance reader and I love Han and Leia, that this would end up being my favorite of the bunch. And I guess I have more complicated feelings about this book. It's not a bad book by any means. There were a lot of things I liked about it. Number one, it wasn't entirely what I was expecting in terms of the plot and what it was covering, so we'll get to that. And secondly, there was a part of the book where I wasn't really vibing with the way that she was depicting Han and Leia and their relationship. I think that improved. I think towards the end it became much more what I expected and wanted, but there were some moments that were just a little bit strange, and the pacing is a little weird. So one thing about this is I expected this to be more of a romance with more of a lead up to the wedding. That is not the case. It is very quickly rushed through at the beginning of him proposing, them getting married within a few days, and then immediately leaving on a sort of government sponsored honeymoon where of course things are gonna go wrong. And so most of this book takes place on what's supposed to be their honeymoon, but ends up being something quite a bit different from what they had expected. I know from one review that I saw that the fact that the early part of this is so rushed may not be the fault of the author. Apparently this is drawing on a comic book that had things happen back to back like this, so she didn't have a lot of options because it is canon. So I hear that, but as a reader, it was really rushed, and I feel like especially at the beginning you didn't get a lot of time for the characters to breathe and connect with each other and process what was going on. They were just like rushing through, boom boom boom. The depictions of Leia for me were a mixed bag. I think in the earlier part of the book, and I guess to a certain extent I get what she was going for. I think it was supposed to be a lighter and more carefree version of Leia as she's starting off on her honeymoon sort of thing. But there's a moment where she's described as giggling and times where she came across as a little bit inane. This wasn't the whole book by any means or all the time, but there were moments that just rubbed me the wrong way when she was interacting with Han. I think that's the thing, is especially Han and Leia's interactions for the early part of the book weren't what I was hoping for. And then it picked up, it got to where it was more of the banter that I was expecting mixed with this really deep care for each other. So it did, by the end, give me more what I was looking for between the two of them. But for the earlier part of the book, the moments where they were on page together especially, I was like, this doesn't really feel like Leia, like what I would expect from a Leia character. And, you know, people can disagree with me on that, but that was my experience. I do think there's some really interesting insight, though, into Leia as a character and where she's at during this time internally. She is still really struggling with the fact that she's learned that Darth Vader was her father, especially given the fact that he tortured her. And while Luke has made his peace with it, she hasn't. And that's a theme that is coming up. She's afraid of people finding out. She hates the fact that he's her father, and she does tell Han, and he responds, you know, fine, appropriately, as he well should, but that's a concern that she has. And I know from earlier in this project reading Bloodline, we see what happens when that secret is revealed and how it does in fact impact her career. One of the other big themes in this book, though, is we're seeing Leia deal with her Force sensitivity, and I think it's really interesting because you have these moments where you realize that Leia has a lot more anger and hatred in her, and I think you're intended to realize that if she were to pursue more training like Luke did, that might be a struggle for her because some of those feelings are, you know, linked to the dark side of the Force, etc. But ultimately she comes to the conclusion that she's not her father, she's also not her brother, and she's got other things to do than go do some Jedi training. That even though the idea is intriguing intriguing. She's got other things on her plate and it's just not a thing she's gonna do. Even though occasionally, because of her sensitivity, she is able to do some force-related things, and we see that in this book. So I did feel like this book had quite a bit of insight into her characterization, especially from those perspectives, and that was interesting. The actual plot of this, once it eventually gets going, is also quite interesting. I just think the lead up to it was boring. The interactions between Han and Leia didn't have enough banter and were kind of uninteresting. The things that were happening, some of it was interesting, but a lot of it was kind of bland. But once they end up doing a side trip to this ice planet where there are some mysterious circumstances and things going on, things definitely picked up. I was enjoying the main couple's interactions more. I was more invested in the plot, and just what was happening was kind of interesting. I don't know why I expected a full-on romance from a Star Wars book, because that's just really not what this is. There are romantic moments and elements to it, and I do think we get some development of the relationship between Han and Leia, and some foreshadowing of the fact that their relationship probably isn't going to last forever, but is still a beautiful thing and an important thing and valuable, even if it's not gonna be forever, sadly. So I liked it, but I didn't love it, and it wasn't my favorite of the bunch. I am glad that I read it though. I think it was enjoyable and it had some interesting elements to it. This I would probably give like a 3.5 star rating to. So these are the 5 books that I read for the project, and I've got to say that for the purposes of my goal, this was incredibly successful. I wanted to dive into the Star Wars book universe because I had felt intimidated by it and wanted to find some books that I might enjoy and see if I can start dipping my toes in and find future places to go. And this worked out. It's whet my appetite to read more Star Wars canon books, and maybe even a few of the most beloved older ones that are not canon anymore since Disney bought Star Wars. But I had a good time. I enjoyed all of them. I didn't give anything below a 3.5 star rating, and I do find them really valuable. I think the audiobooks are excellent. I love the immersive sound effects, the fact that they make you feel like you're really in the world. And yeah, this was fun. So if I was gonna rank these in order of least favorite to favorite, again, remembering I had a good time with all of them, so none of them was bad. I'm gonna give what might be a controversial take and surprise even myself and say that probably at the bottom of the list would be The Princess and the Scoundrel. As I said, I did end up enjoying it quite a bit. I liked it, but very surprisingly, I probably found it to be the least impactful and interesting. Not to say that it wasn't, but probably my least favorite of the ones that I read. There I go, expecting it to be my favorite, and of these 5, it's probably coming in at number 5, followed to nobody's surprise by Last Shot by Daniela Jose Older. This is not a fan favorite. I think it's much better than what the Goodreads reviews would have you believe. It's really interesting to see people's take on this, but I would say that this is coming in 4th place for me. Not a favorite, has some pacing issues, and I wasn't as into it as some of the other ones, but it was a good time. This was fun, it was rompy, the stakes were very high, and I thought this did some really great character work, especially for Han, as he's trying to figure out what it means for him to be a husband and a father. Coming in at number 3 is Star Wars Brotherhood by Mike Chen. This is a close one because I think if this wasn't so slow towards the beginning of it, it would probably get bumped up. I just think the character work in the later part of this book is so very, very good. It fills in a lot of important gaps for Anakin's relationships and motivations. We get more of the internal perspective of Obi-Wan, which I think is really valuable. And again, once it gets into the actual plot of it, it's a lot of fun. It's really interesting. It's got political stuff and action and twists and turns. I think this is very good, and I probably would pick up more from Mike Chen in the future. That is closely followed by my number 2 pick, Bloodline by Claudia Gray. Of the 2 Leia novels that I read, this was clearly my favorite. We have a middle-aged Leia struggling with what her future holds and who she is and the role she's gonna play. Maybe it's the fact that I'm in my mid-30s and my kids are getting older. but I found this really interesting and relatable. Plus, it was a lot of fun. There were interesting twists. I liked the side characters. I liked the way this was exploring the complexities of how politics are always messy, and sometimes there's not necessarily a best option. You get corruption, or you get a Senate who can't do anything. And yeah, I really like this. I think this was very good. Again, I would read more books from Claudia Gray. And finally, in my #1 spot is Thrawn by Timothy Zahn. This book is so good. The character work is fantastic. I think Thrawn is such a fascinating character, and I want to read more books about him. I like this sort of anti-hero strategist character. I don't know if you'd even call him an anti-hero, but he's not a pure villain. Or if he is, it's because he only cares about his own things. He doesn't buy into the ideology of the Empire, but he thinks that the rebels are too idealistic. I thought this was fascinating in terms of character work and politics and looking at the bureaucracy of the Empire and the way things ticked. It was a lot of fun. It was really interesting. Overall, definitely a success. I had a fantastic time doing this, and I am already in the process of acquiring more Star Wars books for my TBR because this has just whet my appetite for more of it. I love this world. I love the characters. I also love a lot of the bigger political ideas that it's playing with. I think especially right now, some of them are quite relevant. So this was a good time. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts on this. Have you read these books? What did you think of them? Do you have other books you would recommend to me given my responses? I would love to know what else you think I should have my eye on. There are several books that are on my wish list that I'm like, I want to read you. So let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, it always helps if you give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.